Hi, I'm Marshall Ramsey, and today on Conversations, we're talking to Alistair Bruce, who is the historical advisor for one of the most popular series in TV history. Alistair ensures what you see on Downton Abbey is authentic to the time period. He monitors everything from clothing and posture to the stiff rules of courtship and marriage, to how British aristocrats interact with each other and the servants who work for them. During a visit to the home of Sam and Mary Haskell in Oxford, Mississippi, Alistair sat down with Sam to talk about the demands of the job.
Alistair, it is indeed my pleasure to get to spend a few minutes with you today and having a conversation about the incredible hit known as Downton Abbey. I also want to talk a little bit about your next Manners special, which is coming up, which is so much a part of what you do as the historical advisor. So in 6 seasons of Downton Abbey, what is your greatest memory personally?
I think really the fact that when we first broadcast the first episode and hoped that we would reach 6 million viewers in Britain, and then hearing that it had got over 8 was such a shock. And first dawning on us that it was indeed a hit, not just in amongst a very small group of British people, but right across the social network. And then when it came to America, it was extraordinary because an enormous number of people who probably heard about it in Britain decided they'd give it a go, and they liked it. And, you know, here I am 6 years on with the huge privilege of talking about what has become something of a phenomenon. And now there are 260 million people watching it worldwide.
It is amazing. And the success is because of all of the elements that Julian Fellowes brought together to create this world that was placed into a time starting with the sinking of the Titanic. Why don't you start us there and give us a little overview of how the Crawley family at Downton Abbey started?
Well, they would have been an ancient family, and the title of an earl. It was a great honour. It came from the king, and it would have been because they owned a considerable amount of land, or they'd had huge political influence in the early stages. And then it passes from eldest son to eldest son to eldest son. Robert Crawley is the Earl of Grantham, and he has 3 daughters. And this is a tremendous problem because women can't inherit English earldoms or Great British earldoms. And so, even though he's received this enormous amount of money from a great American family, the Levensons, through Cora, his wife, who he's married and is now the Countess of Grantham, he's unable to give any of her money, which is tied to the title, to any of her daughters. And that must have been incredibly aggravating. I shouldn't think the American source of the money particularly appreciated that kind of tie. And then we see how this family, but not just the family, those who look after them, this huge extra family of people who are in service to them, get through what is a period of enormous change socially in Britain, from 1912, when the Titanic sinks, right through to at the end of Series 6, where around about 1926. So it's not a huge period of time we've covered. And we see people like Robert Crawley's mother, who is known as Violet, the Dowager Countess of Grantham, played by Maggie Smith. And it's been the most enormous pleasure to work with her. We've seen also links to America when Shirley MacLaine came over and brilliantly played the mother-in-law. And everyone has a particular view about their mother-in-law, whatever it is. And I think that that contribution was fantastic. And, you know, we've just enjoyed it.
For our viewers out there, how prevalent was it that an American heiress would be sought out to come to Britain to marry into a noble family to save the manor, so to speak?
Well, these great stately homes that were built in Britain and are still visited hugely by Americans who come to the United Kingdom today were mammoth mini palaces. They cost a huge amount to build, but then they supported great estates, and they had a large number of fairly cheap people to run them. And what happened in the process of social change is that taxation was increased on the aristocrats, and with socialism and trade unionism giving greater and greater worth to the working man's time, the cost of labour was going up. And it was contracting their ability to be able to live at the sort of levels that they were. And I think that you see this pressure all the time on the family, and they're trying to keep it going. And I think that that's been quite a fun thing to cover.
It's very interesting to me. Mary and I have watched every episode of Downton Abbey. We are huge fans. Our favorite character is Maggie Smith's character, the Dowager Countess Violet. Julian Fellowes, who I've had the pleasure of meeting, has been a friend of yours for several decades now. You met him through his wife. He writes every episode, correct?
He does, and I think that that's a remarkable thing when you look at how long it's lasted. And if you try and understand that, a screenplay for a film generally only covers about 2 hours. Each season of Downton Abbey is about 11 hours of broadcast time-ish. And this has all come from one typewriter. And he is relentlessly able, not just to hold together a narrative that meets the historical requirements of the time, but also a huge cast. And I don't think any of those actors feel that he's ever missed them out. I mean, from time to time, one person has a stronger storyline than another. But in the end, he's touched all of them and brought them into our sense, either as people who we like or who we absolutely detest. And I think that that's been really interesting and maybe made it so sustainable.
One of the things about Dame Maggie Smith's role as Violet, the Dowager Countess, is her one-liners. And Julian has presented some incredible, one-liners for Maggie. One of my favorites was, "What is a weekend?" And I think that they have another one coming up, and I guess this is a bit of a spoiler, but she actually says to someone in the first episode of the 6th season, "Is it cold up there on that moral high ground?" Does he present these to her for her approval, or does she just get them in a script like everyone else and just do them? Or is there a discussion about it?
I've never seen a discussion. I don't think the actors who've been involved in the Downton Abbey project would particularly feel the need to discuss it, because Julian is able to deliver, with the support of the producers he works with, like Gareth Neame and Liz Trubridge, a clarity and a brilliance in script that really doesn't need to be perfected at all. And what Maggie brings and what actors bring to these words is the capacity to bring them to life. And I think that, Julian, him, has a means with his tongue that is so brilliant at finding a sharpness about society, an observation, and the capacity to find humour in everything. And I remember when he went to Royal Ascot with his wife with a massive hat on she was wearing, and he was asked, "Why are you here at the racing?" Because everyone knows Julian's not much interested in the horses. And he said, "I've come as an accessory to my wife's hat." And I think that that is very much where it all comes from. And if you go to dinner with him, he's just endlessly entertaining. But also, he has this wonderful brain that is exercising for me as a historian, because we just love social change, how it's affected Britain, and how that effect in Britain has really permeated all around the West and has also touched the United States.
With so many wonderful characters in Downton Abbey, I think among my friends, the greatest loss was the loss of Dan Stevens as Matthew Crawley. How did that come about? And I must say, you handled the departure beautifully, but did he come to you and talk to Julian and Liz and Gareth about his wishes to leave? How did that all happen?
Well, when Downton Abbey began, the actors were all taken on for a year with an option for 2 further years. I mean, you know about how these things work.
Yes.
And when it came to the end of the 3rd year, Dan expressed that he wanted to do other things. He'd been offered a role, I think, on Broadway. And that was very tantalizing to him and his wife and his new family, and they wanted to come to America anyway. And I think that, it was important to try, first of all, to persuade him to stay, but once that hadn't worked, Julian's view was very clear. If you were a member of the Crawley family and you wanted to leave, you had to die in the story. Because how else could it make sense? He couldn't have just had a baby and said to his wife, "I'm terribly sorry, I'm off for 7 years to India." I mean, we wouldn't have liked him very much.
No.
So it's all right for those below stairs, and some of the characters, like O'Brien, she also left, and that was fine, but we didn't feel the need that she should die. She just went away to another job.
As we lost Lady Sybil.
Yep, no, that too. When she fell into the hands pretty much of Russell Crowe in a film. And, these temptations are, of course, great. And you Americans created these contracts, and so
I know.
you can't blame us, and we just work with what we're presented with.
You mentioned that Dan left to go to Broadway. I happened to have the pleasure of seeing him in The Heiress, playing the role of Morris Townsend, opposite Jessica Chastain, and he was wonderful. And I think he's off now doing Beauty and the Beast, playing the prince/beast for Disney.
I think he'll have a wonderful career. He was a wonderful actor to work with because he was always interested in learning from me, and that makes a huge difference. The small intricacies of protocol that would help him be far more this man coming into a grander lifestyle, living up to it, and being taught what it was going to be when he ultimately had the responsibility of being Lord Grantham himself and preparing for that. Of course, it never came to him, and perhaps one day it will reach his son.
It will indeed. Now, Michelle Dockery.
Yes.
I think among all of our friends who love the series, everyone's concerned that Lady Mary will finally find love again. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I think the pursuit of love for everybody is terribly important. And I think as we watch her look, struggle, always within, I think, a much more difficult time than today, it's easier for people to get to know someone, to live with them, perhaps even to sleep with them and know them intimately. It was really difficult then because the church, which was very prevalent in British society, and also the moral systems that existed to try and constrain everyone's behaviour, made it almost impossible. And of course, we know she was risky enough to go off to a hotel. And of course, she was seen, because you always are if you start behaving like that. She was seen with Lord Gillingham. Now, when you've taken that kind of risk, you put your reputation on the line. Now, reputation still are terribly important. We all understand that. But then it was more so because the sort of deal that existed between the working classes and the aristocrats was that the working classes were sort of content for this senior tier in society as long as they behaved impeccably. And the newspapers were increasing their desire to print any form of tittle-tattle about a well-known name. That certainly hasn't gone away. And so she's vulnerable to all those things, and she can feel it. Will she find love? Well, if she carries on the way she has done, she's going to have a pretty scary time trying to find it.
Let's go downstairs.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the Bates. The Bates storyline has been an incredible one, and one that's created a lot of compassion. How was that developed originally, and did it end up going where you wanted it to go, or did it take on a life of its own?
Well, I think from my point of view, you know, the scripts arrive and I interpret what Julian has written. Julian has a very clear idea, and had a very clear idea right from the very beginning, precisely how he wanted this story to develop. And he has shaped it and developed it, obviously with the risk of some people perhaps leaving. And I think that the public has watched as Bates has presented himself as a thoroughly decent man. And this nobility lent himself to be a defender of his wife and her reputation, no matter what. And as a former soldier, he'd served his country, fighting in the South African War, which was terribly unpopular in the rest of Europe. And yet, we see that he sets great store by the proper behaviours that are around. And she, of course, is terrified after the hideousness of the rape. Rape, of course, is the second most heinous crime after murder. And it always was. But for a woman to make a claim of rape in a time when women were socially less able to hold a position in society than they are now, all part of the great advantages of social change we've seen, Jo, who played the part of Anna, knew perfectly well, because we talked about it, that she had to play into the role this vulnerability, this absolute endless vulnerability. And whereas we want her to tell her husband, go and tell him, he's a decent man, he'll understand, she feels she can't because of the constraints of the time. And that's what Julian's so clever at, getting you into why life was so starched, so restricted, why people had to feel that they couldn't just say what they can today.
Right. One of the things that I discussed with Gareth Neame, one of your other executive producers, who's also a friend of mine, was the fact that it was written, and Julian did a great job, about how much the family upstairs care about their people downstairs. And the relationship between Lady Mary and Anna is so strong, and they seem to care so much about each other, that I'm so proud of the way that was presented. And Gareth had expressed the same thing. In fact, he was in Los Angeles at that time because Joanna
Joe
had been nominated for a Golden Globe, which she ultimately won. And it was for the season of the rape. Her acting was impeccable in that storyline, and I love that. Now, I want to talk for a moment about poor Mr. Pamuk. This actor, and I forget his name, you'll probably remember it because you remember everything, was in like very little of the series, but he is so remembered for that first moment with Lady Mary, and then he dies, and then they hide it until Lady Edith reveals it, and then Lady Mary has to deal with the fallout. Talk to us about poor Mr. Pamuk.
Well, I think, first of all, he was an absolutely beautiful person. And he had arrived in this stately home with beautiful manners, extremely courteous, charming, caught everyone's eye. And of course, he was able to use this sexual charm to woo and captivate this young, as yet untouched woman. And of course, he takes her to a place that she wasn't expecting to go. And we know that she's in sleeping with him, although he sort of brought the situation and controlled it, and she was pretty unable to stop what occurred. He puts her entirely in jeopardy, her whole future. She could never get married because maybe no man would touch her after that. If she got pregnant, what an awful situation this would be. And we have this almost Private Benjamin moment, don't we, where he dies in the midst of his lovemaking. And what a problem for her to deal with. It's not just a problem because you've got to move a body. I mean, that's bad enough. The problem is that you've got to hide it from all the other people in the house. Who are you going to tell? And to tell your mother a thing like that. And you feel the difficulty. But again, what Julian is working within is the tight and starched framework of how people were expected to live. Because English society had done a deal. If you were an aristocrat, to keep your place, ever since the French Revolution terrified the whole of Europe that the end of the old order was coming, the aristocracy decided that it could only keep its place by being impeccably well behaved. And here she is, she's turned the roulette wheel, and it's landed on black, not red. And who knows what is in store for her? Well, we see it all transpire. And, you know, all the time I feel, like so many women of her generation in that class, trying to protect her position in huge vulnerability because everyone's judging. Everyone judged you. The church judged you, society, your friends, everywhere you went, they'd be gossiping behind their back. This was the terror. Amongst all the beautiful clothes, all the lovely hats, it was the deal you did with the devil. You had to be beyond any question well behaved.
As the historical advisor of Downton Abbey, was this based on a story that was somewhat true, or would this have been the way that kind of situation would be handled in any major home that this might happen in?
All the storylines that Julian brings to life in Downton Abbey happened. They happened somewhere in England. They happened in a stately home of some kind. And you know, my research has looked at about 4 or 5 stately homes, and I've drawn all that I know from a study of the letters of the people who work below stairs and everything else, which of course are a huge rich resource, at the account books and things like that. But also the history of these houses is well known. And Julian has been studying this like I have for a long time. And he's brought all these amazing things, turned them into drama, and put them in one house. Downton Abbey, therefore, is a boiling pot of some of the most extraordinary and embarrassing and difficult and anxiety-stretching situations. And I think that makes it a riveting watch.
And this series is going to stand the test of time because of that and because of the exactness that you bring to it. And I want to talk about that for a minute. You did a very successful Manners special about Downton Abbey a couple of seasons ago, and you have a new one that you've just completed that's coming up. What might we need to learn from the second Manners special that we did not learn in the first?
Well, the difficulty with doing the first, and I'm really grateful to PBS for letting me do it, because I think what is great about PBS is it wants to educate, enthuse, and encourage people. And I was encouraged to be a historian by television. That's how I got into it. And I'm loving the fact that I can now take all this huge interest that I've garnered and put it into a format that may just titillate people to want to go on their own journey of discovery. And if they do, they'll find out so much about the background of the protocols we have today. And what was difficult with the first was deciding what not to put in, because there's so much. The fingerprints of how people behave are writ large in my memory, and I wanted to tell it all. And we couldn't, of course, in the first Manners. So more Manners has come about. You know, I'd like to look at all the Manners that have come through the courts of England, that have shown how people behaved right back in medieval times, Tudor times, the Jacobin times, all of it, to bring it so that people really understand why it is that today, when you and I met, we shook hands and we didn't even think about it. It's the protocol of today. I think it's quite interesting because, you know, these things change. When I was a young fellow, you met a woman at a party, and she'd chat away and you'd shake hands with her the first few times. Then finally you might have one kiss. Now you meet somebody. I arrived at an airport here on my tour in America, and someone came straight up and said hello and gave me a kiss. And we can only do that because of antibiotics.
American hospitality
Yes.
at its best.
Exactly.
One of the things in the first Manor special that I particularly found interesting is today, you know, men hug each other. And you had stated that when Hugh Bonneville, as the Earl, was welcoming his cousin, Matthew Crawley, played by Dan Stevens, who we mentioned earlier, into the mansion at Downton, he reached out to hug him. And you said, absolutely not. You would not hug him. You would shake his hand. And they both looked at you because in 2000, and I guess that was 2012, it was a common thing.
Well, I allowed them to shake hands. I didn't really think that they'd touch each other at all.
Really?
Well, I think it'd be very grateful. I think there was a great anxiety when anyone's helped. I mean, nobody really knew where to put themselves. I mean, can you imagine being given somebody's whole fortune? It's very difficult anyway, and I mean, it's entirely up to them, but they did want a sort of massive mangrove. It's fine today, but of course it's taking people back in time to a totally different period and expression. And in addition to that, I find it really interesting the fact that Elizabeth McGovern, who plays Cora, was portrayed coming back from having been away from Downton Abbey for some time, and her grandchildren are lined up at the door. And she got out of the car and she went up to them and hugged them. She leant right down, almost on her knees, and hugged them, and we cut. And I went over to Elizabeth and I said, Elizabeth, what are you doing? Don't touch the children. Nanny touches the children. I mean, you'll see them at tea time. Ignore them. Nobody of your status would touch them. She said, look, I'm an American, which is lovely. It's a great advantage. I don't have it myself. And I am naturally that. And I said, yes, you are today. People touch children now. They didn't then. They simply didn't interact with children, partly to make sure they didn't get spoiled, also to learn that children were seen and not heard. That's how I was brought up. And it's probably made me the kind of difficult person I am today.
What was it like trying to control or to help advise Shirley MacLaine as Grandmother Levinson from the United States, Rhode Island, I think it was?
Well, you know, when you have the privilege of meeting someone like Shirley MacLaine, and you, with the very little experience I have about film, you see this incredible history of endless success and a profile that is overwhelming. You are in awe, but I can't be in awe of anyone if I'm to deliver my job correctly. And I hope that she felt I was true to myself when I was very clear with her. She had a different view about what Mrs. Levinson would be. I saw Mrs. Levinson, from my research into the Rhode Island dignified ladies, as somewhat restrained. And I think the Americans, who were in a position of great wealth and living in these huge houses, wanted to be more aristocratic than the real aristocrats. After all, they sent most of their daughters off to marry aristocrats in Britain, which was almost an export of proper responsibility and love. But anyway, they did it. And I think she took a different view. She wanted to be more modern with it. She was quite keen to hold her knife and fork when she was making comments at the dining room table. I think that that was possibly inaccurate because I know that people were so careful not to do that, to put their knife and fork down and to put their hands in their laps and to make comments. You didn't really shout across tables like you do now. I mean, it's a free-for-all in some places, and I couldn't care less what people do now, but I'm there to make sure that when you transport people back legitimately with their subconscious into a previous time in drama, you've got to get it right. I mean, it makes me so sad that there aren't awards for people who try and get history right in these movies, and that they just go for stories.
My final question. When it's all over and this final season is completed here in the United States, what is your hope that people will remember when they think of Downton Abbey?
That it achieved something in entertainment and that they learnt something about their shared past in terms of the way protocols were and in the way that manners were expressed between human beings who were respectful of one another, and that they find their own way of always maintaining the social contract today by being respectful to one another and finding the manners to respond to that.
Beautifully said.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
All the best.
We wish to thank Alistair too, and our gratitude also goes to Sam and Mary Haskell for opening their home to our MPB crew and for Sam's thoughtful and entertaining conversation with Alistair. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time on Conversations.